Welcome to page 98 of Anatomy Coloring Book. This is Dr. Stephen Harkins, Auditory and Vestibular Systems Part 2. So let's review the auditory system, which was discussed in the last lesson. Here we have a sound wave traveling through the auricle of the ear, the external auditory meatus, and then striking these these waves, whoosh, 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 striking the tympanic membrane. I'll leave it in red. Breaking the tympanic membrane. You can see these little vibrations here. The malleus begins to vibrate, this hammer-shaped or mallet-shaped bone. Begins to vibrate here. We're in the middle ear now, by the way. The sound waves actually travel through the outer ear, the external auditory meatus. And we're in the middle ear. And the malleus transmitted its vibrations via a joint right here, synovial joint, to the incus, which then began to vibrate and shake. And the incus transmits through this little joint right here, transmits its vibrations to the stapes. The stapes, which is shaped like a stirrup. Now the stapes transmits its vibration to the oval window of the vestibule of the cochlea, or more specifically, I should say, the vestibule of the bony labyrinth. The cochlea, it's part of the vestibular cochlea area. It's right here. So technically the vestibule is part of the entire system. So these vibrations, these sound vibrations, go back to red, continue to travel. They're transmitted from the oval window here, which begins to shake throughout the scala vestibuli, all the way around into the new color, into the scala tympani. All the while you can see these vibrations being transmitted into where? Into the cochlear duct as they travel through the scala tympani, or scala tympani. When these vibrations, these waves, hit the cochlear duct, the tectorial membrane begins to vibrate, which sort of shakes the little hairs of the hair cell, kind of starts shaking these little hairs back and forth, activating the signal on the receptors, the hair cells, to the auditory branch, sending a nerve impulse. Now, back to the brain. And that's how you're able to hear. And of course, the sound, once it reaches this endpoint, the round window, the sound is dampened and weakened so that there's no echo going back and forth. And observe here, these couple of arrows right here, also stimulating the cochlear duct while the sound is traveling through the scala vestibuli, also stimulating the tectorial membrane to vibrating the tectorial membrane to stimulate the hair cells of the organ of Corti. Now moving on to the vestibular system. There are 3 canals called semicircular canals. And they are filled with fluid here. That's the superior canal. Superior. Then we have the lateral semicircular canal. Lateral semicircular canal. Let's shrink the size. Down here. And the posterior semicircular canal, and they are each 90 degrees. Okay, enough of that. We'll leave it this. They are 90 degrees from one another, and what they do is they, being 90 degrees from one another, they handle, they sense all different motions in every plane. They can sense a lateral rotation. They can sense a lateral flexion in the coronal plane, and they can sense an up and down motion in the sagittal plane, back and forth this way. And of course, in the middle, the transverse plane, a rotational plane. Very important to this discussion are these little areas called the ampulla. The ampulla are these little rounded out areas here. And what is contained in these ampulla are these structures called a cupola with a hair cell attached to it. Cupola is like a cup, an upside down cup right here. And it's filled with a gel, not as watery a substance, but a gelatinous cupola. And it's top heavy, it's heavy in the fluid. And so it can wobble from right to left because it's massive. So with your body movements. And again, that's contained right here inside these ampulla. These little openings at the base of the semicircular canals. Here, here, and then for the posterior, the ampulla here and here. And so with the various movements of the body, it will stimulate, because of the fluid in these semicircular canals, the fluid starts running this way because the person is bending their head to the left. It's going to shake this ampulla, or excuse me, this cupola, which is inside the ampulla. And when it shakes, these little hair cells, the hairs coming off the hair cells, are going to be stimulated right here. And they're going to send a signal to these cells. There's the nucleus of the cells, down to the vestibular portion of the vestibular cochlear nerve right here. The vestibular portion of the vestibular cochlear nerve. Here's the cochlear branch. Here's the vestibular branch. Where they meet, they become the vestibular cochlear nerve, cranial nerve number 8. It's going to send that signal, that motion signal, when those hair cells get stimulated there. It's going to send a signal up to the brain as to balance, or the head's moving left, the head's moving right, etc. Now, let's say you turn your head to the side, a different motion. Turn your head this way. Well, the lateral, this one here, the fluid in this lateral semicircular canal is going to start moving and shifting and shaking. And the ampulla and the cupola that's inside these ampulla now, here and here, is going to start swaying back and forth to the right and to the left as you move. Well, as it does that, again, these little hair cells are going to get stimulated because of the weight of this cupola, this gelatinous-filled cupola. The mass of it is going to be shaken around, stimulating these little hair cells, which is going to send a signal upward to the vestibular branch of the vestibular cochlear nerve. And off we go. And the same thing. Now, if you shake your head back and forth, up and down, well, that's going to shake this fluid around in this posterior semicircular canal. And of course, the fluid in these ampullae here is going to start shaking, and it's going to shift this cupola around from the left and to the right, or back and forth, whichever direction, here and here. And that sensation is going to be picked up on by these little hair cells, and the signal is going to be sent through the vestibular branch of the vestibular cochlear nerve, cranial nerve number 8, and voila, you have the sensation of rotation. Whether it's rotating here around the, or here in the coronal plane, or here in the transverse plane, or here in the sagittal plane, one of these canals is going to pick up that rotation, one of these semicircular canals. And the ducts are within the canals. The canal is carved out of the bone, and the duct is the membranous portion inside the canal. Now, that's how rotation is sensed. What about linear movement? What about just moving forward and backward? Say you're driving in a car, straight forward or back. How is that motion picked up on? Okay, the previous motion was all about rotation. Rotation in these planes here. In 3 planes. What about linear movements? Straight movements, no rotation, back and forth. Well, that happens, that's picked up, occurs in a different area. In the vestibule, there's this little area called a saccule. And in this saccule, here's the vestibule here, and here's the saccule right here. And if you explode this area out here, you don't see any semicircular canals. What you see is sort of a little stack of little rocks, and they're called otoliths. Otoliths. And that's these sort of little pebble-like structures right here. They're not actually rocks, but they are firm and they do have mass. And these rocks are sitting on top of a gelatinous layer, a layer of gel. And within the gel lie, you guessed it, our old friends, these little hair cells. These little hair-like projections out here. And let's say you start moving forward. Well, because these rocks have mass, Newton's first law of inertia, objects at rest tend to stay at rest. If you move forward, the little otoliths stay where they are. And when they stay where they are, everything else moves forward, but the otolith stays there. These hair cells detect that movement. Once again, these little hair cells, they detect this little shift in movement here. Of course, what do? They become depolarized, and these neurons, and they send their information out right here through the vestibular branch of the vestibular cochlear nerve, cranial nerve number 8, and to information from the brain. Hey, we're moving forward. So they handle linear movement, where the semicircular canals and the ampullae handle rotational movement. So the gelatinous layer here, and these other ones at the bottom, they're supporting cells. Some sort of connective tissue cells, I'm sure, or an epithelial layer possibly. And then, of course, our hair cells. Just a note to confirm that we're on the same page here, that these otoliths, these little rocks here, when a person moves forward, these shift backward relative. And if the person stops, like braking in the car, then the otoliths will shift, in the other direction. And all this information, this sway, back and forth sway, is picked up on by these hair cells. Similar to the ampulla here, when the head is rotated, there's a shifting side to side due to the mass. There's a greater mass than the surrounding fluid here. And since it's a greater mass, it tends to shift or tends to stay in place when movement in the body, relatively when there's body movement happening, rotation and linear movement. Okay, that is the end of page 98. This is Dr. Stephen Harkins, Auditory and Vestibular Systems.